I'm Irven Devore, and I started out life studying primates, but eventually, with Richard leading me, we got to the Kalahari.
I was studying hunting and gathering among the Dobie people from 63 to 65, wrote my dissertation, and then getting a teaching job as a junior lecturer at Harvard, Irv said, let's expand our project and bring in lots of other people. And so we had these wonderful array of bright graduate students, several, most assembled around this table. And it seemed to me that the key to the work was that Devore's vision of a broad spectrum of anthropological specialties working together, from ethnoarchaeology to archaeology, demography, genetics, infant and child behavior, folklore, and maintaining an ongoing dialogue across these subdisciplinary boundaries. So I felt free to pursue my own interests because all the other bases were covered, and so I continued into classical themes in social anthropology, politics, kinship, and ideology, and then got very involved in the rapid social change that was occurring there in the 80s and 90s. And in 1972, we co-founded with the Marshall family the Kalahari People's Fund, which is celebrating its 40th anniversary.
Clisio, inwa clisi, ocha mihe obao te mi katsi me nika iko cha mkaku dua klaike. Ocha mige twa jusa ike senka te jusa I basing kweshanka. Jusa ko kwa dobi, jusa ko kwa chunkwe, te e ku ko koitle ka ngaro kwe ko chi si we shi I so jun klase ka ngaro e. Te e kishe wi te ko e kasi kake I ka ngaro e ko chisan hum kwe. Mi tia ubao te mi ge kwa ju sa trihe I question ka. O ju sa kwe ngai singa, ju sa kwe konta tsikoi, te ju kese, te ju weshi kunika I ko sikusi, te ju kuchwa chwa kwa utwa o Nancy Howell kwea.
I'm going to give my name now. Yeah. My name is Nuka.
Ashe, mi wi ka kama ka tia quinque aike te ika are ngaro ika tresinko jun quasi osi jun quasi dusi ciao chi jean te mi wi
mi kuo chuko koma ngatsao
Ikaw si skamo miku o tunta nga bao ku nga me te kuko me o tunta tsikwi kama kaishi mi kai tsikwi nga. I had a long beard. E mi kang kame ho jusa tri ko kwinki juku ngaro jun esi ko sisi te mi wi.
I'm Ashinga, and I got my name because I have big feet and I'm taller than anyone else in that part of the Kalahari. Not because I'm a great man.
Miku Okasa.
Miku Okoma Go.
My name is Kui, but the name came because they thought I was an easy mark because I gave away a shirt when I first got there, and after that I was, everybody besieged me.
actually had to trust each other from the get-go. You know, one graduate student saying, well, this other graduate student is going to collect data that's really important to me, and that's okay. I can go with that. I wonder if any of you have any comments. John?
First of all, let me say, we liked each other, which was really very nice. We all actually liked each other, and we didn't break up into cliques or stick knives in each other's backs. So just the personal part, the chances of how it works out matters. But I want to speak a little bit from the perspective of being an archaeologist, because, for example, I've worked the last 11 years at Ologasali in Kenya doing archaeological work as part of a very large interdisciplinary group. And it's in that context that I look back on the Kalahari. And I'd say that when you collaborate, there are 3 levels of collaboration. And one is, for example, if you're building the space shuttle, you know, where there's a really very clear goal and everybody's work has to integrate absolutely very tightly with each other. A second lower level of collaboration is what often goes on in archaeological projects. So for me, being at Ologasali, there's the geochemist who's studying tufas. But his goal is different than mine. I'm interested in the Middle Stone Age, and we overlap, but he's interested in the geochemical evolution of the rift. The Kalahari was different than that, and it's sort of like we have little grandkids, and there's this term parallel play, where these kids are playing next to each other, but they're not really interacting with each other. They're doing their own thing. Mel built this big grass screen. What you do is you hide behind the screen and you peer out at this little child sitting on their mother's lap, and then you put up a picture or you hold up a rubber duck or something and see how long the child focuses on that. So I'd go off, I'd excavate, I'd come back at the end of the day with my shovels and buckets, and there would be Mel behind the screen holding up pictures. You know, it was very interesting for me, but what he found out had absolutely no relevance to what I was doing. So I think that what we shared was a place, the sense that this community that we were with was a really unique community.
I was there on my second field trip. It was the fall of '67. The graduate students were due to arrive. And then I had a conversation with Irv. And I said, you know, Irv, I'm a little bit apprehensive because I've got a big program of research. I want to do this, I want to do that, I want to do this. And, but then there's students to be supervised. And so Irv, you may remember this conversation, said, well, you know, you go and do your thing, because my joy is from helping these students develop.
Well, it is true that we concentrated on the Jinkwasi who were living in that immediate vicinity. But one of the things that I did after getting my feet on the ground and learning something of the language was to branch out and work further afield. Richard Lee and Nancy Howell were already living in Kaikai, which was 30 miles away. And Richard and Nancy took me with them down another 30 to 50 miles farther south, where there was another group of Jinkwasi living who were at that time living by complete hunting and gathering. And I hooked up with that group and made repeated trips to them. And it was very important to my study to be able to have that limited diversity of observation of camp sizes, intergenerational relations, child behavior, and I was able to look at what children were doing at that camp and other hunter-gatherer camps that I visited, and to see that in that particular ecological setting, there was really nothing for children to do that was economically or nutritionally useful. Whereas my other work that was done where I had more access to other more far-flung settled communities, I could see that children were being put to work at earlier ages with more obvious economic and nutritional relevance. So I would say that we didn't go all that far afield, but there was some diversity of our inquiry. And the other thing to say is that knowing the language is very important. And if you work with another ethnic group in the Kalahari, you're straying into linguistic waters in which the syntax, the grammar are wildly different, although the sound system is the same.
Just very quickly, one of the constraints was that until 1990, we really couldn't get into Southwest Africa or what is now Namibia because it was under apartheid rule and access was tightly controlled.
The question about sort of what I call reverse anthropology and being aware of how closely observed we were being. I've been making a kind of informal collection over the years of anecdotes about this and would like to put it together at some time. So I'll just tell you one of them. I had occasion to go with two of the leaders of the Farmers Cooperative in Chumkwe over to Shakawe, Botswana for a meeting, and we were staying at a small conference center there, and we were actually having breakfast one morning, and of these two men, Tsamko Toma and Tung, Tsamko had already been to several conferences and had been out of the country even. Ungno had not at that time had the chance. So they were observing very carefully how the breakfast was going to be eaten and so forth. And at one point, I heard Ungno ask Tsamko, why is the bread burned? And Tsamko, Soto Voce, said, they burn the bread in the morning. It's their custom.
Can I tell one story? This is a story about my daughter had all her birthday parties in the Kalahari from the age of 2 on. And once, when she was about 5 or 6, I heard 2 children talking in camp, and one of them said to the other, I have to tell you the most extraordinary thing about these white people. Once, you know, every once in a while they have this feast, and everything's made out of sugar. The bread's made out of sugar. The meat is made out of sugar. The drink is made out of sugar. Everything's made out of sugar. It's just amazing.
I had the feeling right along that they thought it was perfectly understandable why we were so interested in them, because they were the most interesting people in the world, and so that was sort of very logical. On the reverse anthropology thing, they did wonderful physical imitations of all of us, really wonderful and unsettling. And I'll tell you one other thing. There was a guy who I was talking to once, and who said, you know, I see you writing down and everything on pieces of paper, and you're not going to throw those pieces of paper away. You're going to take them back to your home country and sell them. And I thought, okay, that's pretty close, and that's, you know, why there has to be some kind of quid pro quo.
Yes. I'll just add something about their incredible talent at mimicry. There was a police officer in the early 60s who came over from the Southwest African side. His name was Ben Bardnost. He was about 6'4", weighed maybe 280 pounds. And you can imagine, and he was pretty athletic. He was a big guy, and he would come over, and I guess this station commander said, go over and be nice to those people. So we would come over, and of course the people were not were extremely skeptical of how nice this guy was going to be. And so one time he came over and he was chatting with me, and a little guy named Kasupe, Howell, who everybody at this table knows well, got up behind him and started imitating his swagger. And so people who are looking at him are going like this. And he turns around, and then Kasupe is just being very casual. And then he turns away again, and Kasupe starts doing this. He was absolutely hilarious. And so it made me, it brought home to me something I also written up, is that the Jeune Croisiers are people who have a healthy skepticism of outsiders' good intentions, which stands them in good stead.
I had a dramatic incident, which I tried to make the most of and fell flat on my face. First or second day, my family and I were in the Dobie. I was struck by lightning. The Bushmen came over from their camp to ours. This lightning was in our camp. And they were talking about it and so on, none of which I could understand. But I went over after dinner in the evening, and I thought, well, I'll see if I can make something of this. I'll surely be impressed by somebody who was hit by lightning and survived. So through the interpreters, I said to, I think, Kumagoe, what do you think about my getting struck by the lightning? He's sitting there, kind of mumbles. And I said, well, ask him again. I'd really like to know. So he's asked this again, and he won't look up. He just mumbles again. So I said, what the hell is going on? Ask him another time, and ask him, well, he said, so he did. Now Kumagoe looks up and he says, well, we've decided, we feel sorry for you. You clearly have powerful enemies. Enemies.
The Kalahari debate, I would see as one of the fruits of postmodernism, because it starts from the position, these anthropologists who have studied the people, the Kalahari, don't know what they're talking about. And they don't really have a grip on it. And they're first and foremost bearers of Western ideology, and only secondarily, they're actually observing reality. And so if they took off their blinders, they would see that the people, the Dobie Jeune Croisiers, are really serfs, serfs who've been subjugated to the Bantu hundreds of years ago. That's a pretty powerful accusation, a pretty powerful statement. But fortunately for us, there is still archaeology, and there still is history, and there still is observable observations that can be made. And it turns out that that particular view of the Dobie Jeune Croisiers was flawed and faulty, and in some cases just totally wrong. And so I would say it's a ringing affirmation for, yes, there is a reality out there. Yes, we can actually ask questions of it, and it's not all swirling around in our heads.
I'd just like to add that in a sense, the Kalahari debate was not a social anthropology debate. It was an archaeology debate. It was a debate about the past. There is a whole range of ways that agriculturalists and pastoralists coming into a world of hunter-gatherers interacted with the hunter-gatherers as they were moving south. So I think there are a lot of ways that the Kalahari debate, even though in social anthropology circles it's still very much alive in the teaching of students and so forth, I think in the way archaeologists are thinking about the past is over.
What are some ways that their lives have changed since your early visits to the Kalahari?
The traditional trance dance with male trancers involves women sitting around the fire, clapping and singing in a sort of yodeling way, and men dancing around behind them. Although very strong healers can go into trance without all this, there's a feeling that when a dance like this is held, it's really a communal expression. I thought from the beginning that this had a chance of surviving the process of culture change, and part of the reason was Matthias Günther's work in Kansi, which showed that even Bushmen who were no longer hunting and gathering and had a high population density were still doing the trance dance. In fact, they were doing more frequent trance dances because of the population density, perhaps. And I always thought that this could be compatible with a lot of other cultural and economic changes. But in order for that to work, you'd have to have missionaries leaving it alone. And instead, you have missionaries trying to stamp it out. And so I don't know about the future for that reason.
I'm concerned that trance dancing seems to have significantly declined at Chumkwe. At least, I don't know about the outlying villages. And people who I knew were trance dancers who were now Christians say the pastor doesn't want us to and forbids us.
When many of the people from this group came back from the field, things had changed, certainly in the United States and in Europe. The Vietnam War was on. The first really strong ethics statement was made by the American Anthropological Association in 1971. There were questions of confidentiality and privacy, protecting the rights of informants so that they wouldn't be victimized. There were a whole series of major changes worldwide, and similar things were going on in Southern Africa. The anti-apartheid movements were picking up. The larger context was people were really beginning to question what institutions were doing. Should the United States be involved in using napalm in Vietnam and things like that? And this affected broadly other organizations like Cultural Survival, coming out of the idea that people were being pushed off their lands with World Bank and other assistance in the early 70s, late 60s. The same with the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs, which was formed in '68 by anthropologists. Survival International was formed in 1969, partly by anthropologists. So there were a whole set of feelings that people should be involved actively in helping the people with whom they worked.
What's being talked about here is the most positive aspect of the impact of postmodernism on anthropology, which is the idea that people are not in reified cultural time, you know, where things are supposed to stay the same forever, and also the idea that you should ask them what they want and that they should be speaking for themselves.
I think Mel might be giving postmodernism more credit than it deserves.
Oh, okay.
I would call what
I'm happy to give it less credit.
What you're calling postmodernism, I would call critical reflexivity, which is what we are doing when we stop and think, well, where are we coming from? How do we position ourselves? And are the interests of the people being acknowledged? One of the things that kept us together is we all believed and were committed to there was a reality out there that was tangible and understandable. And that, I believe, remains like the touchstone of my interest in anthropology.
Very hard to describe and characterize, but out there.
It's out there.
You know, nevertheless. Very hard, but
yes,
describable.
I mean, there are several good news stories that one could relate about the situation of the Junkwasi in the 21st century. We've already mentioned something about the low rates of HIV, and this is pretty exciting from the point of view of the work that I've been doing since the mid-90s on HIV. there was quite a few predictions that the San people, or the Jinkwasi people of Nainai and Dobi, would, their rates of AIDS, which were low in the 90s, would explode in the 2000s. And I've been back almost every year looking into this, and as yet, that has not materialized. So the Jinkhwa rates of AIDS are about 75 to 90% lower than the national rates of Botswana and Namibia. And that's been confirmed by several restudies. Now, lest we feel too comfortable about that, far more serious is tuberculosis. And so tuberculosis is a much bigger health issue for the Jinkwasi than is AIDS. And it's usually that if you've got TB, then you've almost surely got HIV as well. But in fact, in the case of the Jinkwasi, everyone who's diagnosed with TB is also tested for AIDS, and the tests have come back over 90% negative, 95% negative. So we're happy. That's one good news story.
In many ways, our research group, particularly in our activism, in some ways mirrors the egalitarian sharing and social contract, if you will, of the Jinkwasi themselves. And I'd like to say that I think there are at least two reasons for that. One is that most of us here who formed the Kalahari People's Fund and who started our research and bonded ourselves into a research group, were actually socialized, partly socialized during our 20s by some very good socializers, egalitarian socializers, and so we learned some good models. And the second thing is that very early in all of our careers, we transformed ourselves from being just a research group into being an advocacy group, and therefore have focused to some extent in our lives on a larger purpose outside of ourselves and possible competitiveness and petty squabbles. So I think that partly the Kalahari People's Fund played a role in the way we learned the lessons of the Jinkwasi, many of which are about egalitarianism. Anyway, the Kalahari People's Fund, which I mentioned, was formed almost 40 years ago, has had as its mandate, worded differently in different decades, but right now we're saying that we provide aid, assistance, and advocacy for San, Bakalahari, Nama, and other indigenous peoples of semi-arid southern Africa. And we have been especially active recently in the areas of education, particularly mother tongue education, community water development, communication networks, and also cultural heritage documentation. Some of our most positive experiences have been in providing a funding channel for very small startup school projects in various parts of southern Africa. We have been a long-term supporter of the so-called Bana Bametsi school in Shakawe for street children. Bana Bametsi means children of the water. And we have also more recently been supporting the Topnar Education Fund for school children in the Walvis Bay area of Namibia. We are a more recent supporter, starting in 2010, of the Nandavu School in Zambia.
I had the experience over the last couple years of going through several thousand photos, some of which you saw, flashed on the screen, and looking at those people some of whom I remember and know, and some of whom, you know, I can't quite place. I think it underlines the sense of the reality of the humanity of these people, that they are struggling with conditions of survival that makes them in some ways completely unique, but in other ways just like everybody else. There's an attitude that we can bring to trying to understand what these people are doing that is a contribution, if not directly to the people of the Kalahari Desert, to our common humanity, and that it's worth making the effort, and it's a very gratifying thing to do.